Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. School Janitor Short Timer, submitted by Janet. I started working the night shift at an elementary school in 2013, about 6 months after I'd been hired as a janitor. The building sat on the edge of a rural town surrounded by fields and quiet two-lane roads. During the day, the school was loud and full of kids, and at night, it felt like a completely different world. My shift started at 4 p.m. and ended at midnight. By the time the teachers left and the buses were gone, the building settled into a strange kind of quiet. The fluorescent lights above humming was the only consistent sound. Every once in a while, the heating system clicked and groaned throughout the walls, but most nights it was just me and the custodian supervisor, Ray, but he usually stayed in the maintenance office filling out paperwork while I cleaned. The school had one unusual feature for such a small town: an indoor pool attached to the gymnasium. The swim team used it during the winter, and the elementary kids had lessons there during the week. Cleaning the pool area was part of my job. The first time something weird happened was in October, right around 6 months after I started. I was mopping the hallway outside the locker rooms when I heard a splash, and it wasn't a small sound either. It sounded like someone had jumped into the water. I stopped mopping and listened. The pool area was supposed to be empty. Swim practice ended at 4 and everyone had gone home hours earlier. I pushed the mop bucket against the wall and walked through the swinging doors into the pool room. The water was perfectly still. The overhead lights reflected off the surface like glass. I stood there for a minute waiting to hear something else, and nothing happened. So I shrugged it off and went back to work. I told myself it must have been the pipes. But the next night, it happened again. This time I was cleaning inside the girls' locker room when I heard running footsteps in the hallway outside. They sounded small and quick, like a kid sprinting past the doorway. I stepped into the hallway expecting to see someone from the basketball team, as sometimes they stayed late. But the hallway was empty. And then as I stood there, I heard something else. A locker door slammed somewhere inside the boys' locker room. The sound echoed throughout the tiled corridor, and I called out, "Hello?" I didn't get an answer. I walked inside the boys' locker room, my footsteps echoing across the floor, and every locker door was closed. The benches were empty. But when I turned to leave, I noticed something on the floor. Wet footprints. They were small, definitely a child's. They started near the showers and trailed across the tile toward the hallway, then just stopped halfway across the room. There weren't any more prints after that. I stared at them for a long time before finally grabbing my mop and wiping them away. And that was the first moment that I felt uneasy working there. And after that, things started happening almost every night. Sometimes I'd hear giggling echoing from the pool room while I was working down the hall, and once I heard the unmistakable sound of a kickboard slapping the water, like someone was playing in the shallow end. But every time I checked, the pool was empty. One night while sweeping the pool deck, I watched one of the plastic lounge chairs slide across the poolside by itself. It didn't tip over or jerk suddenly, it just moved slowly, like someone invisible was dragging it. I froze with the broom in my hands, just staring at it. It stopped moving after about 2 feet. The next day, I checked the security cameras with Ray. The footage showed the chair moving exactly the way I had described it, but of course there was no one there. Ray laughed and said, probably the ventilation kicking on. I looked at him and said, "Ray, ventilation doesn't move chairs." He just shrugged. "You know what? You work alone too much," he said. "Your imagination's running away with you." After that conversation, I stopped telling him every little thing I heard or experienced. But the activity escalated. I'd walk into the locker room and hear the sound of children whispering behind me, even though the room was empty. and more wet footprints appeared on the tile when the pool hadn't been used in hours. One night I was cleaning the teacher's lounge when I heard something from the gym hallway. A ball bouncing, slowly and rhythmically. I followed the sound of the gym entrance, expecting to see a basketball rolling around, but instead I saw one of the cafeteria tables sliding across the hallway floor. On the security camera that Ray and I checked later, it looked like the table simply started moving by itself. Ray still blamed air pressure. By December, I dreaded going near the pool area. The air in that room always felt colder than the rest of the school. The smell of chlorine hung heavy in the air. Even when the water was still, I got the feeling something was moving beneath the surface. The worst night happened a few days before Christmas. It was close to 11:30 p.m., almost the end of my shift, and I was mopping the hallway when I heard violent splashing from the pool room. Not a single jump like normal. This sounded like someone thrashing in the water, the splashes echoing off the walls. For a moment, I just stood there frozen. Then I grabbed my radio. "Ray, you in the office?" No response, and the splashing continued. My first thought was somehow a kid had snuck into the building and had fallen in, so I quickly pushed the door open and stepped in. And what I saw stopped me cold. The pool water was churning, for lack of a better word. Waves were rolling from one end to the other, slapping against the edges, but there was no one in the water. The overhead lights flickered slightly as the waves grew stronger, and I took a few steps closer to the pool with my heart hammering away in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, and that's when I heard the creak. Slow, like wooden fiberglass bending. I looked over to the diving board, and at first I didn't see anything. Then something moved. A small figure stepped into the light. It was a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, but something was horribly wrong with him. His skin looked bloated and gray and stretched tight like he'd been underwater for days. His hair hung in wet clumps across his forehead, and dark water dripped from his clothes onto the diving board. His eyes were open looking at me, but I have to say they looked empty and dead. He stared right at me, and I couldn't move. For a few seconds, we just looked at each other across the room. Then the board creaked again as he bent his knees, and he jumped. The splash was enormous, and water exploded upward and slammed into the deck, soaking my legs and chest. As water ran down my face, I screamed. I didn't even check the pool. I just turned and ran. My shoes squealed across the tile as I sprinted through the hallway, past the lockers, past the gym, all the way to the front doors, and by the time I burst out into the parking lot, I was shaking so badly I could barely breathe. Ray came running out a minute later after hearing the alarm door slam. "What the hell happened?" he asked, and I told him everything. The splashing, the boy, the diving board. I told him about the splashing and the boy on the diving board. He stared at me for a long time, and then he kind of sighed and said, "Come on inside." I reluctantly went in, and we sat in his office, and for the first time since I started working there, Ray wasn't laughing. Instead, he was rubbing his face like someone carrying a secret. And finally he said, "You're not the first one to see things like this." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" I said. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Back in the 70s, a boy drowned in that pool." I felt a chill roll up my spine. "He wasn't supposed to be in there," said Ray. "He snuck in after hours with some friends. Something happened. I think he hit his head, and they left before anyone realized that he couldn't swim. And they left him there. People found him the next morning." "Why didn't anybody say anything about this?" I asked. And Ray looked pretty uncomfortable. Well, the school didn't want the attention, said it would scare the other parents and kids, so the parents agreed to keep it quiet. I sat there in silence, remembering the way that boy looked on the diving board, bloated and gray, just staring at me. "Did he look all swollen up?" Ray said. I just looked at him and said, "You've seen him too, huh?" Ray didn't answer. He just told me to go home. That night driving home, I was shaking all the way, and I didn't sleep. The next morning, I typed up my resignation. I worked there for 6 months before things started happening, and only a few weeks after that before I finally quit. While I don't live there, I do go back to visit family, and the school is still there, standing at the edge of town. Kids still swim in that pool. And maybe nothing ever happens during the day, but I know what goes on in that school at night. Watching Mrs. Ribsy, submitted by Grace and Light. Love your channel. I've wanted to share this story for a long time and finally got around to typing it out. I'm a 32-year-old single mom, and for about a year I worked the overnight shift as a caregiver for a 92-year-old woman named Eleanor. I'll call her Mrs. Ribsy, and that's not really her name. I'm keeping that for privacy. She lived in a quiet little neighborhood of our town in a ranch-style house with a big backyard and old trees that creaked whenever the wind picked up. A really nice place. Most nights I stayed with her were completely uneventful, and honestly, that was the whole point of the job. Eleanor's daughter hired me because her mom still insisted on living at home, but she had fallen twice that year. Our arrangement was pretty simple. I arrived at 10, stayed until 6 a.m. to be there in case something happened. If Eleanor woke up disoriented or needed help to the bathroom or had a medical emergency, I'd be there. But in the 10 months that I worked there, nothing serious ever happened. Eleanor always slept like a rock. Most nights I'd make myself a cup of tea, watch TV quietly in the living room, or just read while listening for movement down the hallway. Meanwhile, my kids, ages 10 and 8, were back home sleeping at my sister's house. My sister and I lived together after my divorce, so she stayed with them while I worked nights. It was a good setup. It was a relaxed job. Seemed to be pretty easy money, and everything seemed safe. At least, I thought it was safe. The night this happened started like any other night. I arrived a little before 10, and Eleanor's daughter was just leaving. She gave me the usual update. Mom's already asleep. She had a good day. I would always say, perfect. That night she smiled, grabbed her purse, and left through the front door. I did my routine walkthrough, something I always did when I arrived. I checked to make sure the doors were locked, and I peeked into Eleanor's bedroom to make sure she was sleeping comfortably, and then settled into the living room. Around 10:30, I realized I'd left my phone in the kitchen plugged into the charger that I kept there. I figured I would grab it later. Big mistake. I remember thinking the house was just so quiet and serene, and outside the windows the neighborhood looked dark and still. Eleanor lived at the end of a cul-de-sac, and after about 9 p.m. there was almost zero traffic. I sat down to watch a true crime documentary when I heard something. A faint sound. Tap, tap, tap. At first I thought it was a branch brushing against the siding, and there were big maple trees in the yard. But then I heard it again. Tap. This time it sounded closer, like someone was touching the glass of a window. I muted the TV. The living room had a large front window that looked out toward the driveway, so I stood up slowly and stepped closer, and that's when I saw movement outside. A shadow passed across the front yard. My first thought is maybe it's just a neighbor walking a dog or something, but then the shadow moved again, slowly and deliberately, like someone was crouching low. I took a closer look and could see that it was a man. He was walking along the edge of the house, keeping close to the wall. He wasn't just passing by. This guy was looking at Mrs. Ribsy's house. I backed away from the window and my mind immediately went to my phone in the kitchen, still charging, on the other side of the house. I moved quietly down the hallway toward the kitchen, trying to not make any noise. My heart was pounding so loud it felt like it was echoing in my ears. As I got to the kitchen, I peeked through the small window above the sink that faced the side yard. And there he was, standing maybe 10 feet from the house. A man in a dark hoodie. He was staring at the windows, and he was checking them out. I ducked down so fast I nearly knocked a chair over. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone off the charger. And then I heard something outside. Footsteps on the back patio. He had moved around the house. I think he had been checking every entry. I'd crouched low and dialed 911, but before I could press call, I heard a crack. The sound came from the back of the house. It was glass breaking. My heart jumped into my throat and got stuck there. This guy was breaking in. I whispered into the phone, but panic made my fingers clumsy and I actually dropped it onto the floor. The screen went dark. And then I heard something worse. The sliding back door opening. I didn't dare move as I heard footsteps come into the kitchen, heavy and slow. The guy was inside the house. I slid quietly behind the kitchen island and stayed crouched down, barely breathing. The man walked only a few feet away from me. I could see his boots. He had a flashlight and was sweeping it slowly across the room, and I heard him whisper to himself, "Old lady's probably asleep." My chest tightened. He thought Eleanor was alone, which meant he definitely wasn't expecting me. The flashlight beamed past inches from where I was hiding, and then he walked out of the kitchen toward the living room. The moment his footsteps faded, I grabbed my phone again and tried dialing 911. I didn't have any signal for some reason, and then I remembered the house had terrible reception in the back rooms. I stood there frozen for a second, just trying to think of what to do. If I ran out the front door, I'd have to pass through the living room where he was. And that's when I heard him opening drawers, and I could hear furniture shifting around. He was rummaging through things, and then a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around. He was standing in the hallway, his flashlight beam hitting me in the face instantly. We both froze, and for a second or two neither of us even moved. Then he said loud enough for me to hear, "Well, this is a problem." He stepped closer. The guy wasn't huge, but he was a hell of a lot bigger than me, and he spoke to me directly. "Listen," he said quietly. "You didn't see anything. I'm just going to leave." My voice came out shaky in reply, saying, "I'm calling the police." He shook his head slowly and said, "No, you're not." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a length of rope, and my stomach turned cold. "Look, I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but if you make trouble, I'll tie you up and gag you until I'm gone. You understand?" By now I had gotten to my feet and was backing up slowly down the other hallway behind me. My mind was racing. Behind me, just a few feet away, was Eleanor's bedroom. And in that moment, I thought of something that was also inside that room. Eleanor's life alert system, the big red help button. The man noticed that I was kind of side-glancing behind me, and he just said one word, "Don't." But I stepped backward anyway, and he said two more words, "Last chance." I took that chance, and I opened Eleanor's bedroom door. There she was, asleep in her bed, completely unaware of what was happening. The life alert base sat on her nightstand. I could hear the man moving towards me quickly, and I slammed my hand down on the red button. A loud voice blasted from the speaker. "Emergency response activated. Help is on the way." The guy jumped up like he'd been shocked. "Fuck, are you kidding me?" he said, and then he bolted. He ran through the short hallway, back through the kitchen, and I heard him crash through the broken sliding door again. I stood there shaking, staring at Eleanor, who obviously had woken up and was looking confused. She asked me what was going on, and I just grabbed her hand and said, "It's okay. Police are coming." The next 5 minutes felt like 5 hours. I kept peeking through the kitchen window, terrified the guy might come back inside. And finally, the red and blue lights were flashing out through the trees. 2 police cars screeched to a stop outside, and officers ran around the house with flashlights. Within seconds, one of them shouted from the backyard, "Got him!" I later found out he'd been hiding behind Eleanor's shed trying to climb the fence when the officers caught him. Apparently, he'd been breaking into houses around the county for months. He never expected someone to be in this house awake. After the police left, I sat in the kitchen shaking while Eleanor drank tea like nothing had happened. "You did good, sweetheart," she told me. I laughed nervously and said, "Honestly, Eleanor, I just panicked." But the truth is, that quiet overnight job never felt the same again. And every time I see one of those Life Alert commercials on TV, I remember how close that night I came to having things go very, very differently. My Past Came Back, submitted by Samo T. I worked nights as a security guard at a manufacturing facility on the outskirts of town. The place made industrial valves and pressure fittings, heavy steel stuff used in pipelines and refineries, but I suppose in the grand scheme it doesn't really matter what they did there. I'm just telling you. During the day it was loud and busy and full of shouting workers, and at night it was the exact opposite. It was quiet. My name's Sam. At the time I was 29. I'd been doing security work for a few years, bouncing between warehouses and construction sites, and the valve plant was easily the biggest place I'd ever been responsible for. The building stretched nearly the length of 2 football fields, with shipping docks along the back and a maze of offices, machine rooms, and storage areas inside. Company policy said night security required 2 guards at all times, and for good reason. But the night that this happened, my partner Dave called off sick. I remember getting the message from my supervisor, Carl, about an hour before my shift. "Dave's got the flu," Carl said over the phone, "but don't worry, we're sending someone over from the other site to cover." I said, "Okay, what time will he be here?" "He'll probably just be a little late, so just start your rounds and he'll let you know when he gets there." To me, that sounded normal enough. So I showed up at 10:45, grabbed my keys and radio from my lockbox, and started the shift. Before going in, I always checked out the parking lot, and it was empty except for a handful of employee cars that were left there from second shift. Who knows, maybe they got a ride home, maybe they had car trouble, maybe they went out drinking. I don't know, not my business. But I knew that there would be nobody inside. So, once inside the security office, I logged into the camera system. We had a 32 camera feed system, and you could flick across the monitors to check out the loading docks, the hallways, the parking areas, machine floors, etc. So I checked everything, and everything looked normal. Midnight came. Then 1 a.m., and still no partner. I tried calling my supervisor, but it went straight to voicemail. I figured maybe the replacement guard got stuck at the other facility, or maybe hit traffic. I mean, it was annoying, but it wasn't unheard of, so I just kept doing my patrols every hour, walking the perimeter, checking doors, scanning checkpoints with my little RFID wand. I should say that this place always felt bigger when I was alone, and every echo seemed louder. Around 1:30 a.m., I was back in the security office when the alarm panel beeped. Not the full alarm, just a door sensor. I leaned forward and checked the screen. Dock door 6, forced contact attempt. That meant someone was pulling hard enough on the door to rattle the magnetic sensor. I told myself, probably the wind, but I grabbed my flashlight and radio. I clicked the radio on saying, "Control to partner, checking dock 6. I said that before I remembered I didn't have a partner, and I got a little laugh out of that. So I stepped outside into the cold night air, and the loading dock sat behind the building, facing a row of empty freight lanes and a dark tree line beyond. My boots were just crunching on the gravel as I walked along the dock doors, and everything looked fine. Door 6 was closed tight, and there was no damage. So I checked the lock, everything was good, and I returned inside. The moment I sat down, the security phone rang. It was the line employees used to call the guard desk. I picked it up and said, "Security." And for a second, there was only breathing. Then a voice said, quiet and calm, "Working alone tonight, huh, Sam?" My stomach tightened. "Who the hell is this?" I said. And the voice just chuckled softly and said, "Just checking," and then hung up. I stared at the phone for a minute and figured, prank call. But something about the voice bothered me. It sounded familiar, and how the hell would anybody know I was working by myself? Why would anybody care? But before I could think about it any further, the alarm panel beeped again, this time louder. Dock door 4, tamper alert. I stood up, and now somebody was definitely messing with the building, and messing with me. I grabbed my radio and flashlight again and stepped outside, my eyes scanning the long row of dock doors. The wind had picked up a little bit, and it was rattling a piece of loose sheet metal somewhere on the roof, and I looked up instinctively. But when I got to dock 4, everything looked normal. But then I saw something that made my heart skip. The latch on dock 5 was hanging loose. It had been cut. Someone had sliced the padlock clean through. I keyed my radio. "Control to supervisor," I said. No response. Of course. Fucking Carl was probably asleep. I pulled my phone out to call the police non-emergency line when the security phone inside started ringing again. I could hear it faintly through the office wall. So I hurried back inside and picked it up and said, "Security." It was the same voice as before. I thought you'd noticed the lock. Now my pulse was pounding. Okay, who the fuck is this? "You still carry that little pistol, Sam?" Only my supervisor and the higher-ups knew that I carried a firearm on duty. Then the voice said something that really made me want to shit my pants. "You still owe me money." And immediately I knew who this was. "Mike, for real?" I said. There was silence for a moment and then a laugh. "It took you long enough to figure that out, dumbass." Mike and I had been friends years ago, and we'd grown up together, played cards together, watched football on Sundays. But then he got really deep into sports betting. One night he got really drunk while we were watching a game and claimed that I owed him a couple of $1,000 from a poker game a while back. The truth was, we'd settled that months earlier, and I paid what we'd agreed on, and we went our separate ways. Yeah, I did owe him $800 and squared up with him. As far as I knew, we had. "Mike," I said, "we settled that dude." And he just said, "Did we?" This time his voice wasn't even close to being playful. It was hard and it was angry. Then the alarm panel suddenly erupted with noise. Dock door 5, breach. Metal slammed somewhere in the building and my chest tightened. "Mike, don't fucking do this. You're gonna get into trouble." But he had hung up. I grabbed my radio again. "Control to supervisor. Emergency situation at the plant. Possible intruder." Nothing from Carl. So I triggered the facility alarm. Sirens began wailing across the building and echoing throughout the empty machine floors. Not only did it automatically alert the alarm monitoring center, it also would dispatch police. But again, this plant was huge. If Mike was already inside, it would take officers several minutes to reach me. And again, remember everybody, I was alone. Despite having my sidearm, I was getting a little nervous. I grabbed my flashlight and moved into the main hallway, and the overhead lights flickered slightly from the alarm system activating. The building suddenly felt like a cavern, and it felt like a place I had never been before. Every footstep echoed. And then I heard something. Metal clanging from the machine floor. I moved slowly toward the doorway, my hand resting on the grip of my firearm, and I called out, "Mike, don't do anything stupid." The clanging stopped and there was silence. Then there was a voice from the darkness. "I'm here to collect, Sam." And a figure stepped out between two massive milling machines. It was Mike, but he looked different. He looked really thin. He had thinning hair. He looked old as hell. And he had these wild eyes. But what drew my attention was the crowbar in his hand. "Mike," I said slowly, resting my hand on my firearm. "Police are on their way, buddy." "You think I fucking care?" he said. "I want what's mine." "Dude, you know I paid you that back. It was $800 and we settled it." He started to shake his head violently back and forth and said, "You cheated me." And then it became this back and forth of me saying I didn't and him calling me a liar. After a minute or so of that, he charged me, and the distance between us was maybe 15 feet. Everything happened so fast. I backed up and instinctively raised my firearm. "Mike, stop!" I shouted. But he kept coming. He raised the crowbar up to hit me. He was mere feet away, and I fired. The gunshot exploded through the building. It was deafening in that empty space. Mike collapsed to the floor and skidded beside me as the crowbar clattered across the concrete out of his hands. And for a few seconds, I just stood there, shaking, my ears ringing. And then the police sirens arrived outside. Officers rushed in minutes later, guns drawn, shouting commands until they saw Mike on the ground and me standing with my hands up. I'd already put my firearm at my feet. The funny thing is I realized during all of this, no one had tried to reach out to me on my radio. But paramedics came in, and I will say Mike survived, though he was in rough shape. While the officers took my statement, though, one of them asked me something that really chapped my ass. He said, "You were seriously working this whole place alone?" "Yeah," I said. "My partner called off, and my supervisor said a replacement was coming." The officer shook his head and said, "This is a big facility for one guy." They took me downtown and processed all my information, checked out my licensing, and made sure I was square with that. It was a long, long night, and I didn't get home until 1 or 2 in the afternoon the next day. There would be more long days of interrogations and questions, me filling out tons of paperwork, but that's another headache and a story for another time. Carl did call to check on me, but he didn't sound cool when he did check on me. It didn't seem like he was interested in how I was doing or how I was feeling. He just wanted to know where I was and if I was coming back to work. So, when I did get back for my next shift, Carl called me into his office and he looked irritated. "You caused a huge fucking situation the other night," he said. "I want you to be aware of that." And I just stared at him. "Are you serious? Someone broke into the building and attacked me." Carl just said, "Well, corporate's now involved. You think you're up to your ass in police reports? I wouldn't want to be one of the guys down the hall. And apparently you knew this guy who broke in?" And I said, "Yeah, he's an old acquaintance." And I remember him leaning back in his chair looking smug and looking like the biggest asshole on the planet. He said, "Honestly, Sam, this is going to fall on you. Bringing personal issues into the workplace is a huge problem." I could not believe what I had just heard. "Hey, you left me alone against policy." And he immediately snapped back with, "We're short-staffed, things happen, what the fuck was I supposed to do?" Before I could respond to that, the office door opened. 3 tall guys in suits stepped inside. One was Mr. Henderson, the owner of the company, and the only one I recognized. Carl immediately stood up and said, "Sir, we were just," and Mr. Henderson interrupted him and said, "I know exactly what you were doing." The look he was giving Carl was not a good one. "I'm told security policy requires 2 guards at night. Why was this man left alone to watch a facility by himself?" Carl started stammering things about short staffages, and Henderson cut him off and said, "You lied to an employee, put him in a dangerous situation, and didn't even think to fill in for one of your missing employees." Carl went pale. Mr. Henderson turned to me and said, "I've read your police reports. You followed procedure, defended yourself. While not ideal, I'm glad you're safe." Then he shocked me by saying, "Take the next 2 weeks off, paid." He then looked at Carl and said, "That does not come out of his vacation pool." Carl looked like he was going to shit, and as I left the office that day, the reality of the night finally hit me. It's like I'd been walking around the last couple of days in a haze. But I looked back, the empty building, the phone calls, and the moment when Mike came running out of the dark. It's stuff that I relive over and over in my brain now. Mike pulled through, and I'm not really sure where he's at now, but that's none of my business really. It was very traumatic for me, and I stayed on that job for another 4 years before opening up my own security practice. But I assure you, years later, I still remember the sound of him banging that crowbar in the dark, and that feeling of being all alone. I'm glad I no longer work a night shift. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. It's all free and it all helps out with the algorithms, so I appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description and consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything: a ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.